2.5 million years of evolution have passed since the appearance of the first hominids on Earth to the emergence of the first species of humans that inhabited Africa 200,000 years ago and then migrated from there to the rest of the planet. During that period that we consider prehistory, and that reaches the year 3200 before our era, for which I leave you a link above, to a great documentary that will tell you everything about the prehistory of the world, the human being went from being a nomadic hunter-gatherer to building the foundations of complex civilizations. Around the year 3200 before our era, writing appears in ancient Mesopotamia, and it is the moment that gives rise to the history of our world and the beginning of the Bronze Age, which would extend until the year 1200 before our era. But in the year 1200, the worst catastrophe of antiquity occurred, a transitional period of the Dark Ages in the Middle East, the Aegean, North Africa, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean. It is the period of the collapse of the Bronze Age. But up to this point, the advances of civilization were extraordinary. The Bronze Age was a period that saw the rise and evolution of increasingly sophisticated states, some of which became empires. A period during which civilization itself spread and prospered in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, Anatolia, Greece, and in America. In previous videos of our Origin series, for which I'll leave you a link above to all the episodes in chronological order, we already told you everything about the emergence of our world, that of life on Earth, and that of the first civilizations. But now we will travel to the year 3200 before our era, to the moment in which this extraordinary stage in the history of humanity begins. The Bronze Age.
Welcome to our channel. Discover the captivating episodes of our Origin series, for which I leave a link above, guiding you through the history of mankind in chronological order. Don't miss this incredible journey. Subscribe, like, and share to help us reach even more curious minds. Thank you.
The regions in which the greatest development of the Bronze Age occurred were close enough to each other that continued long-distance trade was possible. While wars were relatively frequent, most interactions between states and cultures at the time were peaceful, revolving around trade and diplomacy. Every state, large and small, oversaw diplomatic exchanges, written in Akkadian, the international language of the day. Although the first cities began to emerge in prehistory, around the year 8000 before our era, like Jericho in Palestine, Catalhoyuk in present-day Turkey, or the first cities of Mesopotamia. The first great civilization was Sumeria. This civilization arose after the rearrangement of the Mesopotamia region, after the invasions it had suffered from the shepherds of the Zagros Mountains. Mesopotamia went through several centuries of disorder and decline, but the invaders ended up assimilating the culture of the region they had conquered, and strove to reach the previous standard of living. Thus arose the Sumerian civilization. The Sumerians dominated Lower Mesopotamia throughout the 4th millennium. Its main city was Uruk, located on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River. A new type of material began to be developed there in Mesopotamia around the year 3000 before our era. Bronze. And this marked the beginning of the Bronze Age. Bronze was important because it revolutionized warfare and, to a lesser extent, agriculture. The harder the metal, the more deadly the weapons created from it, and the more effective the tools. At the same time, right there, writing is born, which makes it possible to document trade and finance. Around 3100 before our era, the Sumerians had an authentic script. They wrote on clay tablets, using a punch that produced wedge-shaped marks. This type of writing is known as cuneiform writing. Writing was then a very complex technique, since the Sumerians had a sign for each word, which meant a huge inventory of signs that only the priests mastered. This provided a lot of power to the priestly class. Thus, Sumerian is the oldest language of which we have written evidence. Meanwhile, Egypt was getting organized. For the year 3200, King Narmer of Hierakonpolis unified Upper and Lower Egypt. Egypt was in the pre-dynastic period. Narmer and his descendants, the first dynasty of kings of Egypt, consolidated the royal power and unity of the country, spreading the idea that the king was a god who owned the entire Nile Valley. Narmer established the capital of the kingdom in Thynis, and built the city of Memphis on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, intending to make it the capital. Thus, in the year 3200 before the current era, the first nation-state in the world was formed. Under the first dynasty. the Egyptians built canals, with which to irrigate the areas of the valley farthest from the Nile. Specialized workers emerged, boats were devised with which to transport materials on the river, agriculture and livestock were promoted, and other advances that were undoubtedly part of the Canaanite Mesopotamian influence. Egypt continued to receive and assimilate Sumerian knowledge. Shortly after the year 3000, they had adapted the Sumerian writing system, but, instead of writing on clay tablets, the Egyptians used a more sophisticated medium. Their signs did not become schematic like the Sumerians. On the contrary, they represented very clear figures, but following the Sumerian principle that a sign corresponded to each of the words, with all the complexity and elitism that this entails. Egyptian writing is known as hieroglyphic writing. Around the year 2280 before our era, a first period of Egyptian history ends, known as the Archaic period, and the so-called Ancient Empire begins, in which the heyday of pharaonic Egypt occurs, the era of the pyramids. A period of Egypt, for which I leave you a link above to a documentary about it. In the year 2580, Cheops built the largest of all the pyramids. It was located near the city of Giza. Made up of more than 2 million stone blocks, most of which weighed more than 2 tons. Then at his side, the pyramids of his sons, Khafre and Mycerinus, were built. Egyptian kings developed an ostentation and a luxury unusual until then. Meanwhile, by the year 2600, the civilization of the Indus River Valley was already reaching its splendor. This civilization may have had a population of up to 5 million people, nearly 10% of the world's population, larger than that of Egypt and Sumeria combined. It spread to cover part of the current states of India, Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. It covered an area of more than 1 million square kilometers, and spanned several periods, up to the year 1900 before the current era. The main settlements are the well-known cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Its large streets, shops, and large multi-store brick houses were abandoned more than 3,000 years ago. Like the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, it depended on its river. Like the Nile, the Indus overflowed its banks every year, flooding large areas and depositing fertile sediments. This immense agricultural potential was the basis on which urbanism developed around the Indus River. The Indus cities traded not only agricultural products, but metals such as gold, silver, lead, and tin, jewelry and semi-precious stones, tools, utensils, and pottery. Trade with Mesopotamia was very important. Crossing the great desert plains that separated both regions was a feat for men who traveled on foot and transported their merchandise in wagons. Instead, it had the advantage of not depending on the monsoon. His traces have appeared in Sumerian and Akkadian documents. The abrupt end of the Indus Valley urban civilization was not the result of war or invasion, but most likely the conjunction of a series of natural disasters and a change in climatic conditions. It seems likely that this ancient civilization, like the Maya, suffered from gradual changes in rainfall patterns, which would have made it difficult to grow food for such a large population. Towards the year 1700 before our era, in Mohenjo-daro, there were tectonic movements that caused a change of course of the Indus, fires, floods, and a hasty flight from the city. All of these early great civilizations had one thing in common: water. The Nile River in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, and the Indus in Pakistan. It was the rivers that made it possible for these civilizations to flourish. The rivers made the soil fertile, and no other soil was as fertile as that of Egypt, allowing them to feed the workforce that built the Great Pyramids. The Pyramid of Cheops was their greatest achievement. The population grew, and so did the cities. By the year 2000 before the current era, Thebes had become the largest city in Egypt, with 120,000 inhabitants at its peak. By then, agriculture and livestock had also grown in China and America, in Greece, and on the Iberian Peninsula, and eventually spread to northern Europe, which coincided with the heyday of the region's cultures. This occurred at the same time in the great civilizations of the East. In the year 2500 before our era, Stonehenge was built in the south of England. Even today, we do not know how it was built. It probably had some religious function. Similar megalithic works were built in other places in Europe. From the year 3000 before our era, commercial exchanges began to increase. Not only through trade routes by land, but also by water. The earliest and most extensive trade routes were on rivers such as the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates, leading to the growth of cities along these rivers. The domestication of camels, later, also helped encourage the use of overland trade routes, linking the Indus Valley with the Mediterranean. This led to cities growing in number wherever there was a port of call, going from caravan to ship and from ship to caravan. The Bronze Age saw the emergence of something new. The increase in large-scale warfare. In Mesopotamia around 2334 before the current era, a Semitic-speaking official in the court of the king of Kish, one of the Mesopotamian city-states, overthrew his ruler and assumed royal power. He called himself Sargon. This would be the beginning of the Akkadian Empire. Sargon would then conquer much of the world known to the Sumerians, and unite it under the rule of a single ruler, thus forming one of the first empires on Earth. It thus ended the period of powerful independent city-states, united by little more than culture and language, and ushered in a new period of empire under a single, centralized ruler, the concept that would expand greatly after Sargon's death, inspiring all the empires that would follow in the Middle East and Europe. Around the year 1650 before our era, Egypt was attacked by the Hyksos, who rose to power and founded the 15th dynasty. They would rule Egypt for 100 years. The Hyksos had begun to settle in the territory of Egypt since the 1990 before our era. It was a Semitic people that had its origin in the Near East. They were thus progressively becoming strong in different cities of the country, and when they were sure of their superiority, decided to attack. The Egyptians always felt safe from foreign invasions, so their army was not equipped to repel attacks. They still used copper and not bronze weapons, and the Egyptian soldiers did not even wear armor. "2,000 years after the appearance of the first civilizations in the East, the first advanced civilization in Europe would arise, on the island of Crete, south of the Aegean Sea. The Minoan civilization. Located southeast of Greece, the island had already received groups in the Neolithic that probably arrived from Anatolia around 7000 before our era. Although from the year 2700 before our era, Crete began to have a boom because of the introduction of the wheel in pottery and bronze metallurgy, it was not until the year 2000 before our era that it flourished as the first advanced civilization in Europe. At its height, its population would reach more than 100,000 inhabitants. From there, the construction of the great palaces, characteristic of this culture, began, particularly in the city of Knossos. Writing also emerged at this time. The island would have been unified under a central power located at Knossos. The commercial exchange with the exterior of the island was very important. Crete was strategically located at the center of maritime communication between Asia, Europe, and Africa. Agriculture and livestock continued to develop, along with commercial activities. All this resulted in a rich economy that kept this society safe from social unrest. They were very religious, and their strange gods demanded human sacrifices. By 1550, the Minoans were hit by the violent eruption of the Santorini volcano, one of the largest eruptions in history. Then, the territory was affected by earthquakes. All this caused the decline of the Minoan civilization. "5,000 years ago, a simple innovation transformed the ancient world. It was such a versatile and valuable novelty that it generated wealth on a global scale, boosted international trade, and ushered in the development of civilizations. Around the year 3000 before the current era, this invention was bronze, kick-starting a whole new era. A period in which civilizations arose, spread, and prospered in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in Anatolia, and in Greece. We will now look at the Late Bronze Age period and explore everything that happened from the year 1550 to the collapse of the Bronze Age in the year 1200 before our era. A period in which links between societies are established on a much broader scale, by sea and by land. The Minoans and Mycenaeans, the heroes of the Homeric legend, built their palaces in Crete, Greece, and the Aegean Islands. Pharaoh Ramses II, he would reign during this period, becoming the most powerful pharaoh in Egypt. Enemies of Egypt, Hittite warriors, dominated what is now Turkey and northern Syria. While the Canaanites, merchants on the Great Trade Route, controlled what would become the Holy Land, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. It was a world made up of many kingdoms, totally different in design and culture, but when archaeologists began excavating these territories, in the 1930s, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. They began to see that the destruction of most of the towns, palaces, and major cities had in all cases occurred in the years around the 1200 before the current era. In this 50-year period, the Mycenaeans are gone, the Minoans are gone, the Hittites are gone, the Canaanites are largely gone, and Egypt is so weakened that it will never be the same again. They were the most important peoples in the world, and they all turned to dust at the same time, within a generation or two. What follows from there will be given an ominous name, the Dark Ages. Civilization as we know it disappears for a couple of hundred years. But it's also the Dark Ages because there are no written records. Archaeologists were perplexed by the evidence of mass migrations that took place throughout the ancient world and all around the year 1200 before the current era. The destruction of the cities they left behind bears witness that it was not a peaceful exodus. Whether the cause of the collapse was natural disasters, or the invasion of foreign peoples, or some other event, remains a mystery even today. We return to Egypt, and we are in the year 1650 before our era, at which time the Hyksos had seized power over all of Egypt and would reign for 100 years. For about 100 years, the Hyksos ruled Lower Egypt, but the Hyksos were unable to maintain control in Upper Egypt. In Upper Egypt, the rulers of the city of Thebes rebelled against the Hyksos rule. Meanwhile, they studied and copied the superior weapons of the Hyksos, captured and bred horses, and prepared for the day they would retake Lower Egypt. Finally, Pharaoh Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos from Egypt. The Hyksos had a lasting effect on the culture and military progress of Egypt. With Ahmose I, the new kingdom of Egypt was born, in the year 1540 before our era, as a newly unified nation under the rule of a king. The period of maximum splendor of civilization would begin, the Second Golden Age of Egypt, at which time, it also achieved a great territorial expansion. With the beginning of the period of the New Kingdom, the First Empire of Egypt was born. Egypt was not an empire until the New Empire. That is why we speak of kingdoms, when we refer to the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, since until the New Empire, Egypt had not extended its domains to other peoples. One of the first pharaohs of this period was Thutmose III. Thutmose III came to the throne of Egypt because his father, Pharaoh Thutmose II, and his great royal wife Queen Hatshepsut, had not had male descendants. Chance was generous with Egypt, because Thutmose had all the qualities necessary for a good ruler, and one more, his extraordinary military ability, which, added to his unfailing courage, earned him the loyalty of the most powerful army in the Near East. Egypt had great military power during his reign. The Egyptians had achieved from the Hyksos great advances in the art of warfare, in addition to the development of horse-drawn chariots. These chariots would be part of most of the warfare in the last part of the Bronze Age. In 1457 before our era, the rulers of ancient Retinue tried to free themselves from the yoke of Egyptian hegemony. They allied themselves with the kingdom of Mitanni, and with that of Kadesh. Megiddo also joined this alliance. This Canaanite coalition was commanded by the king of Kadesh. Thutmose then gathers a large army of chariots and infantry, numbering 10,000 men, to repel this revolt. They head towards Megiddo, a fortified city near Mount Carmel, in present-day Israel. On the other side of these hills, Pharaoh's enemies wait ready to meet him. The fate of the empire is at stake. The two largest armies ever seen in the ancient world were preparing for combat. Everything would end in the Battle of Megiddo, the first battle in history for which there is a detailed historical account, and it ends with an Egyptian victory, which forced the Canaanites to retreat to the city of Megiddo, where they were later besieged and defeated. With the re-establishment of Egyptian rule in Canaan, Thutmose III began a reign in which the Egyptian empire reached its time of greatest expansion. Thebes would thus become the capital of the most powerful empire in the world. By 1353, Egypt was the most powerful nation in the world. Pharaoh Akhenaten comes to power, who along with his wife Nefertiti, decided to challenge the entire ancient Egyptian faith system, shaking the very foundations of the Egyptian worldview. His ideas brought the nation to the brink of the abyss. Akhenaten's idea was dramatic and revolutionary. To replace the pantheon of 2,000 traditional Egyptian gods with just one, the creator of all, the sun. And he did. For the traditional priests, who had dedicated their entire lives to the old gods, and had been extremely powerful until then, it was a catastrophe. Akhenaten began to acquire dangerous enemies. After suffering several family tragedies, Akhenaten was poisoned. By 1332, Egypt was amid intense internal unrest. It is the moment in which Akhenaten's son takes power. The little 9-year-old Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun acceded to the throne at the age of 8 or 9, under the tutelage of the Vizieri, who would ultimately be his successor. The kingdom was economically weak and in crisis after the disruptive reign of Akhenaten. Diplomatic relations with other kingdoms had been neglected, so Tutankhamun sought to restore them, particularly with Mitanni. It was Tutankhamun who rescued the old gods and restored power and prosperity to Egypt. He began to restore the ancient monuments damaged during the previous period. The priests returned, more powerful than ever. And life returned to normal. No Egyptian pharaoh ever tried to change the established order or challenge the gods again. In this second golden age of Egypt, the nation had the most powerful army in all the Near East. The Hittites of Asia Minor were their greatest enemy. During this stage of the Bronze Age, wars were brutal. The pharaohs participated in battles from chariots that were used like modern tanks. The Hittite infantry could not stand against the chariots and the Egyptian army. But in 1323 before our era, Tutankhamun died at the age of 19. There are no surviving records of the circumstances of Tutankhamun's death, so this matter has generated considerable debate and significant study. Tutankhamun was buried in a tomb that was unusually small for a pharaoh, in the Valley of the Kings. His death may have come unexpectedly, before the completion of a larger royal tomb. forcing his mummy to be buried in a tomb intended for someone of lesser rank. His tomb would remain undiscovered for 3,000 years. Meanwhile, in the West, Greece was under the power of the Mycenaeans. By the year 1600 before the current era, the Mycenaeans had conquered most of Greece. They had reached mainland Greece around 2000 before the current era. They were an Indo-European people who would have come from Epirus and the Balkans. They were a lower civilization than the earlier settlers they supplanted, and spent 400 years assimilating the higher culture of their predecessors. The Mycenaeans were great warriors. By the year 1400 before the current era, they had invaded Crete and subjugated the Minoans. They were enriched by the culture of the Minoans. The city of Mycenae became a center of wealth and power, with a warrior civilization without equal in the Aegean area. The period of Mycenaean splendor goes from the year 1600 to the 1150 before our era. They built imposing palaces. The ruggedness of the terrain in mainland Greece made total control over the Balkan Peninsula impossible. But not the sea. The construction of a powerful fleet allowed them to adventure and conquer overseas, and replace the Minoans as rulers of the Aegean. They established trade contacts with Italy and Sicily, and were part of a trading network in the east. Mycenaean life is also marked by great religiosity. The future Greek pantheon begins to be drawn at this time with the Indo-European deities contributed by the Greeks. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Artemis, Athena, Hermes, Ares, and Dionysus. At this time, the legendary heroes arose. The great Hector, the giant Ajax, the almighty Achilles, Ulysses, Perseus, and the greatest hero of all, Hercules. But all these heroes and their stories were more myth than history. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in China, in 1766, the first important dynasty was established, the Shang dynasty. Descendants of the Longshan culture, which emerged in the late Neolithic, around 3000 before the current era, near the middle and lower reaches of the Yellow River. The Shang kings built large walled buildings and imposing temples. A civilization based on agriculture. It is the second dynasty in Chinese history, after the Xia dynasty, but the first whose historical existence is documented. It was succeeded by the Zhou dynasty, the last dynasty prior to the imperial period. Its territorial extension covered the valley of the Yellow River. By 1279 before the current era, Egypt was still the most important nation in the known world. And in that year, the greatest and most powerful pharaoh of the new kingdom would come to power, which in turn is the peak period of ancient Egypt. Ramses II. Ramses would take Egypt to new heights. His successors and later Egyptians called him Great Ancestor. He was the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty of Egypt, who ruled for about 66 years, until 1213 before our era. He was the son of Pharaoh Seti I and his great royal wife Tuya. At the age of 15, Ramses already had authority over part of the army. During the first 5 years of his reign, Ramses II carried out 5 successful military actions. A naval battle in the Delta against the attack of Shardana pirates. Expeditions to Asia, as reaction to threats from the Hittites. Conquests in Libya, where he established several colonies, and built various fortresses to watch over them. And the greatest battle in history up to that time, the Battle of Kadesh. In Asia Minor, the Hittites were expanding their empire. The Hittite king was a great rival of the Egyptian pharaohs. In the 5th year of his reign, Ramses II decided to cut off the Hittite attacks. A conflict in Egypt arose over control of Kadesh. In 1274, Ramses II led his army north, towards Kadesh. The Battle of Kadesh was the greatest battle of the Bronze Age. It involved 6,000 chariots. Ramses returned triumphant. But in reality, in this war, there was no winner. The Hittites sent representatives to negotiate peace. A formal peace treaty was concluded between the parties. It is the first peace treaty in known history. To close the deal, the Hittite princess was given in marriage to Ramses. The last part of the Bronze Age was a period when diplomacy reigned. The kings sent emissaries to different places. War ceased to be the only solution to conflicts. All kinds of treaties were closed between the kingdoms. Through diplomacy and intermarriage unions, the territorial states of the Near East became more connected than ever. It was an era of great kings, but none more important than Ramses II. He was a great builder. Large buildings were built during his reign. Much of the workforce was made up of Egyptian workers. But there were also Hebrew slaves from the Canaan region. It is believed that it was during the reign of Ramses II that the account of Moses emerged. Moses is the one who would lead the Hebrews back to Israel. The last part of the Bronze Age was a period of important commercial exchanges. All kinds of products were exchanged. The cities became commercial centers. But the civilizations of the Bronze Age were coming to an end. By 1200 before the current era, the Eastern Mediterranean suffered a serious setback. All major cities were affected. The great civilizations of the Bronze Age were collapsing. These, the greatest civilizations of the time, were wiped out. Tens of thousands died, or were displaced. Everything collapsed. What happened at the end of the 13th century remains a mystery. It was the disaster that appears in Homer's Iliad, and in the Odyssey, in the books of Joshua, and in the Old Testament. But what caused this epic destruction is still a mystery. What is believed so far is that the collapse was the product of various environmental phenomena added to invasions by the peoples of the sea. the Near East, was affected by droughts. The rivers dried up. The crops were lost. A great volcano erupted in Egypt, affecting the climate of the region. And the peoples of the sea came from the north, and taking advantage of the weaknesses of the different civilizations of the time, they attacked, looted, and destroyed everything in their path. The palaces of Crete and Mycenae were destroyed. For 200 years, the great civilizations of the Bronze Age were destroyed or seriously impacted. Trade between the cities ceased. No written records have been identified for a period of 200 years. Europe and the Middle East entered a dark age. What is undeniable is that something totally new emerged after all. For a couple of centuries we will have the Dark Ages, while the melting pot heats up, but from all this, from the ashes, the phoenix is reborn. New political systems and new civilizations arise. The Greeks emerge, and democracy as we know it will eventually emerge. Whatever caused the collapse of civilizations in the Bronze Age had destroyed a world. There was the twilight of the old and the rise of the new. The chain of events that ended an era, and which gave way to the next one, is still being investigated. The next period in history is the period of the Iron Age, that extends from the year 1200 to 600 before our era. The period of emergence of the Greek civilization, of the powerful Athens and Sparta, of the origin of the Phoenician civilization, of the kingdoms of Israel and Judea, of the Assyrian Empire. And it is also the period in which the Roman monarchy begins to emerge.
At the beginning of the 13th century, men learned to melt iron and combine it with coal to produce steel. Iron ore is soft and useless, but steel is a hard metal, so it had incalculable strategic value. With iron, more resistant swords and spearheads began to be made, capable of piercing enemy shields, armors, and helmets. But iron was also crucial in the development of agriculture. By supplying hoes, plowheads, or sickles that are as strong as they are sharp, it made possible bigger harvests with less effort. The discovery took place in the southern Caucasus around the year 1300 before the current era, in an area controlled at the time by the powerful Hittite kingdom. Iron casting techniques were much more complicated than those of bronze, requiring much higher temperatures. The Hittites kept the new technique a secret, waiting to be used on a large scale. Thus, for some time, the civilized regions ignored their existence. However, for the nomadic Indo-European tribes, a few iron weapons could be decisive in small fights with neighboring tribes. So the new techniques spread north among the Indo-European peoples. And that marked the beginning of the Iron Age. As we explored in our previous episode, for which I leave you a link above, by the year 1200 before the current era, the Eastern Mediterranean suffered a serious setback. All major cities were affected. The great civilizations of the Bronze Age were collapsing. These, the greatest civilizations of the time, were wiped out. Tens of thousands were killed or displaced. Everything collapsed. What happened at the end of the 13th century remains a mystery. But one thing we do know is that the so-called Sea Peoples were one of the factors that drove the collapse of these great civilizations. They were a group of peoples who migrated to the Near East during the 13th century before the current era, sailing along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The identity of the peoples of the sea has been an enigma. The violence of the pirate attacks increased. as did the confusion among the devastated civilizations. These invading peoples completely changed the map of the region. Egypt had rejected the Sea Peoples, but after Pharaoh Merneptah's death, Egypt fell into near anarchy. The Sea Peoples went to Cyprus, and from there they attacked Phoenicia. In the year 1200, they razed the cities of Tyre and Sidon. In that same year, Palestine was also occupied by the Sea Peoples. These called themselves Peliset, although they are now known as Philistines. The Phoenicians were extraordinary blacksmiths. They were the greatest sailors in the world. Inhabited since the beginning of the second millennium before the current era by Canaanite Semites, historical Phoenicia extended over a narrow coastal strip of 40 kilometers from Mount Carmel to Ugarit. A total of about 300 kilometers. Its territory was divided into small city-states, separated by rocky spurs. Its soil, mountainous and not very suitable for agriculture, oriented its inhabitants towards maritime activities. And using iron keels, they revolutionized shipbuilding. They were the first great explorers and reached the Atlantic. They established trade networks and settled in new colonies and cities. Carthage was the most famous of these. But the most important contribution of the Phoenicians to humanity was not shipbuilding, exploration, or trade. Their greatest contribution was the alphabet. His alphabet laid the foundation for the development of writing throughout the West. In 1191, the king Shubbaluliuma II dies, and with him, the Hittite Empire disappears from history, dismembered by the Sea Peoples and internal uprisings. To the northwest of Anatolia, the Phrygians began to stand out. Assyria began a long period of frustrating struggles in which it tried to dominate the surrounding territories without success, but could not control Babylon and especially the powerful kingdom of Urartu. By 1190, Babylon had been freed from Assyrian domination, but its Kassite rulers were unable to take advantage of the situation, and it was left in anarchy. Who did know how to react was ancient Elam, that sent expeditions to plunder Babylon. From Cyprus, the peoples of the sea attacked Canaan and advanced again towards Egypt. In 1177, Ramses III managed to repulse them in what is considered the first naval battle in history. But this would be his last campaign. Egypt lost its imperial possessions thereafter. Its borders were reduced to the Nile Valley. By 1078, the new kingdom of Egypt had ended. Meanwhile, in the Balkan Peninsula, around the year 1100 before the current era, the Dorians occupied the Peloponnese, completing the conquest of Greece, and definitively ending the Mycenaean Age. Walled cities became self-contained units under Dorian rule, known as polis. Sparta became a major Dorian polis, while Mycenae, Tiryns, and other major cities of the earlier period were burned down and reduced to sad villages. There were, however, a few regions that were freed from Dorian rule. One of them was Attica, with Athens at the head, and another was Arcadia, located in the highest mountains of the Peloponnese. In these areas, an Ionian identity emerged that claimed its legitimate occupation of Greece against the invading Dorians. By 1075, in Canaan, the Phoenicians and the Philistines were occupying the coast with some prosperity, while the Israelites were consolidating their conquests. By 1050, without Egyptian intervention, the Israelites were able to penetrate Canaan more easily. Little by little, they were confronting the local cities. On the other hand, they could not prevail over the Philistines, who, despite being few, had iron weapons. The tribes of Judah and Simeon were included in the Federation of Israel. By 1024 before the current era, the Hebrews were united behind their first king. It was Saul. If Israel wanted to survive, it needed to unite under a single command. Crowned by the prophet Samuel, he thus became the first king of Israel. Saul fought to secure the kingdom of the Israelites. The Philistines were his great enemy. The war against the Philistines was constant. Saul eventually confronted Samuel and became suspicious to the point of paranoia. Among the victims of his suspicions was a young Jew who had moved to Judah after the annexation. His name was David, and he belonged to an important family from Bethlehem, south of Jerusalem. David was an intelligent politician and also a good general. David became one of Israel's great warriors. Saul then tried to assassinate David. And David had to flee Israel. Saul continued his fight against the Philistines. Around 1000 before the current era, a Philistine army once again confronted Israel. The Israelite army was overwhelmed by the heavy Philistine weaponry. Saul's son died in battle. Then Saul, seeing everything lost, committed suicide. The Philistines once again gained hegemony over Israel, as if Saul had never existed. After Saul's death, they were completely at the mercy of the Philistines. For Israel, the need for a strong king was indisputable, and the only candidate was David. David was proclaimed king of Israel in the year 991 before the current era. A crown passed to the exiled David, who became the new king. His mission was to secure a new home for his people. That new home was Jerusalem. In 990, David led an attack on the city, the one that was captured and became the capital of Israel. Once the new capital was established in Jerusalem, David's efforts to unify his two-member kingdom turned to religion. Among the fertile Israelite mythology, the part that offered the most unifying possibilities was the one referring to Moses and his alliance with God. With the nation politically and religiously united, David found himself with the strength to initiate an imperialist expansion. One by one, he conquered the Hebrew kingdoms of Ammon, Moab, and Edom. He then advanced even further north. He did not attempt to attack the Phoenicians. In this way, the Israelites saw themselves as owners of an empire of respectable dimensions. Meanwhile, in China, around 1050 before the current era, the kingdom of Zhou, until then a vassal of the Shang dynasty, began an attack on it. The battle marked the end of the Shang dynasty and the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty ruled for 300 years. Chinese kingdoms became vassal states. China became a mosaic of kingdoms under the rule of the Zhou. But in 771 before the current era, a threat appeared on the western border. Barbarian peoples besieged the capital of Hao. Barbarians breached Hao's defenses. The city was looted. The Zhou king had to flee. After Hao was sacked, the Zhou migrated to eastern China. There, they would prevail another 500 years, but the real power over China was no longer in his hands. In the Middle East, by 961 before the current era, King David was near death, and succession tensions were higher than ever. In 960, David's son, Solomon, was crowned king. His reign was Israel's golden age. The kingdom flourished. By 940 before the current era, the external situation, until then so favorable to Israel, began to change. In that year, the first king of the 22nd dynasty, Shishong I, came to the throne of Egypt, and Egypt was once again united. After the death of Solomon, which took place in 931, different revolts generated a complete dismemberment of the kingdom. Syria took over northern Israel, and Ammon regained its independence. In 926 before the current era, a king of Egypt, Shishong I, invaded Judah, sacked Jerusalem, and took much of the treasures that Solomon had accumulated. Meanwhile, in the east, a new superpower was emerging. This superpower was arising in Assyria. By 870, King Ashurbanipal II had established a new Assyrian empire. The city of Nineveh was the center of the empire. Ashurbanipal II, for the first time, had an army fully equipped with iron weapons. This made it the most powerful army on the planet. Ashurbanipal destroyed the Aramean principalities, restoring prosperity to Assyria. In Kalach, he built a large palace of some 24,000 square meters in area. From there, the Assyrian Empire would become the largest the world had ever seen. Ashurbanipal II is remembered as the cruelest of the Assyrian kings. He carried out mass executions. He imposed a policy of terror that made the subject peoples desist from the slightest attempt at rebellion. But he left an indelible mark of hatred of Assyria throughout the Middle East. Subjugated populations were deported from their lands, taken to Assyria to work as slaves. In 859, Ashurbanipal II died and was succeeded by his son, Shalmaneser III, who decided to extend the domains of the already extensive empire that his father had bequeathed to him. But from 824, after the death of Shalmaneser III, Assyria began a period of decline ruled by weak monarchs. In 745 before the current era, a general staged a coup, ending a dynasty that had ruled the country for 1,000 years. The new king took the name of a great Assyrian conqueror and became Tiglath-Pileser III. Under his rule, Assyria resurfaced. It achieved a huge expansion. He imposed tribute on Israel, Damascus, and Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser III died in 727 and was succeeded by his son, Shalmaneser V. By 622 before the current era, Assyria found itself surrounded by enemies, ready to swoop down on the empire. By 612, the Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians invaded and destroyed Nineveh. It was the end of the Assyrian Empire. In its place, a new empire arose, centered around the greatest city of the ancient world. It was the Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled there and made Babylon the most powerful nation in the Middle East. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was the greatest city on earth up to that time. He built the imposing Ishtar Gate. And the legendary Hanging Gardens. $250,000 people lived in the city. In 587, Nebuchadnezzar led his army west towards Jerusalem after a revolt by the Israelites. The Israelites took refuge behind the city walls. But the Babylonians besieged the city, and after 18 months of siege, they attacked and plundered everything in their path. They then burned the city, and the Jews were taken as slaves to Babylon. And in Babylon, they did something that would change the world forever. There, they wrote their history and their beliefs in what was the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible. Beginning with the creation, Noah's Ark, and the worldwide flood. The call of Abraham and the promised land. Slavery in Egypt. Moses and the 10 plagues. The Exodus and the return to Canaan. The texts written in Babylon would become the foundation of two great religions. The Jews remained in Babylon for 50 years until the city was conquered by foreign invaders. Babylon would then become the heart of one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen, the Persian Empire. But we will explore all about the Persian Empire and everything that happened in the incredible period of time of the classical antiquity in next episodes of our series from the year 600 until the year 500 before the current era. It is the period in which the apogee of the Persian Empire occurs, that of the ancient Greece, the empire of Alexander the Great, the Persian Wars, the clashes between Athens and Sparta, and the rise and peak of the Roman Empire. Thank you for coming this far. Please don't forget to subscribe. leave us a like. And if you like the content, don't forget to share it. Also remember that in our channel, we have a playlist in which you will have all the episodes of our Origin series in chronological order and by stages of the history of our world. Thanks for watching.